How's it going, everyone? It is I, Anime Outlet, and this is part 7 of What If Deku Had Ultra Instinct. And now, before I start this What If off, I would like to shout out True Beta for making the thumbnails for this series, a link in the description to their channel. And now, let's begin. The teachers and heroes come back and tell Izuku they couldn't find anyone else remaining on the premises, and it is best that they just take everyone up, put them on a bus, and head back to UA, where they can get the proper treatment if they were either injured or hurt in some way. Izuku would agree with them, as they would help kids onto many different buses, as they had 3 just because of the sheer amount of kids that were going on this trip. So when they would hop on the bus, they would then head towards the UA campus. It was very late at the time, being around 9 to 10 when the attack started, and it finished after just around 2 hours. And so the very long trip, the buses would end up arriving just at about sunrise. So when they would get out, Nezu would end up greeting them and asking them how their trip had gone, as their plan was to leave very late at night after their relaxing day. However, that didn't go to plan at all. So when Nezu was there, he would see just people being brought out, as Nezu would quickly go and call Recovery Girl to bring backup to help them bring them up to the Recovery Girl's office. So they would do that to everyone who was injured, as Nezu would ask what had happened. As Aizawa would point to Izuku, telling him he'll explain to you, just go to your office or something, as they really don't need to have these students hearing about all of this. Nezu would nod his head, as Izuku would follow him to his office. So, what happened, Izuku? Well, the villains somehow found out where we were, and a villain attack occurred. I think the traitor somehow snuck away when we weren't looking, and I don't see how that's possible, unless there was someone who could just sneak away without any of us knowing, like she wasn't even there in the first place. So Nezu would nod his head. Do you think it could be the girl with the invisible cork? It would make perfect sense, as all she had to do was just remove her hero costume and you couldn't be able to see her. That might actually be true, Izuku would follow Nezu's question. So, I think we may have found our traitor, but we can't go assuming things just yet. I also wish to find the missing student, Todoroki. Missing student? You're telling me Todoroki was kidnapped? Oh, we can't have this. The press can't find this out. If the third best first year was captured, or if one of the best first years were captured, they'd have a field day in the media. Izuku would nod his head, just agreeing with Nezu. Yes, and that's why I believe we have to start this war prematurely. So Nezu would nod his head, as Izuku would tell Nezu that Momo Yaoyorozu had managed to put a tracking device on one of the villains, and that could possibly be where the villain's hideout was located at. Nezu was nodded his head, as he would then look over towards Izuku. So, that means we're about to go into war, huh? Yes, I would suggest starting to arm everyone and get them prepared. I wish to do this within 2 days, so I would suggest you just telling all of the UA students to go back to their homes for a vacation for a week. Well, those of them that are participating in this battle, I guess. Nezu would nod his head, as he would then issue out a school-wide announcement to all of the kids entering the school that day, telling them that after this day they would have a week off of school and to possibly just go on a vacation with their parents. So that would end up happening, as Izuku and Nezu would end up planning out all of the things that would end up happening. Meanwhile, in the villain base, Todoroki was being just unchained up from the chair he was sitting in. So, what power do you promise me? I've already gotten the just power of ki after being trained by that fool Izuku. Guess he couldn't really tell that all I needed was power to overturn this hero society, Todoroki would say, just laughing like he was joking, as the villains would nod their heads, thinking that they possibly just found someone who was going to turn into a villain anyway. So they would end up giving Todoroki power, which just happened to be more training. However, it was the training directly from All For One, basically making Todoroki the direct underling to All For One, as he had tried to train many of the people there at the League of Villains. However, many of them just weren't strong enough, having very low levels of ki, such as Dabi and Shigaraki. So somehow, when he trained Todoroki, he just had so much level and experience with ki that he was able to train him so much further, giving him the power that Todoroki desired to just defeat his father and possibly kill him once and for all. So Izuku would be sitting in Nesu's office, wondering what they should be doing now. So, you have everyone set, right? Yes, I do. Well, then let's prepare for war. I say we head out tonight. Nesu would nod his head as they would end up mobilizing everyone from the UA campus, as they would move out into the city, trying not to cause any just spark or flare-up, causing people to just be like, why is there so many people in the streets right now? It's quite late. There shouldn't be this many people. There's usually never this close to many people. However, they would end up going stealth and trying to just hide their presence at all costs. However, after they would end up being seen right outside of the villain hideout, as they would look at the tracker that Momo had given them, and there was the base, as All Might would jump in using his quirk to smash the wall down, and there stood All For One and the League waiting for them as they had spotted them moments before. I've been expecting you all, and I see you've brought quite the force. Kurogiri, why don't you go ahead and just show them the force we've gathered throughout the months that we've been waiting for such an event to occur, All For One would say, as Kurogiri would open up a massive portal, revealing a massive warehouse, as hundreds of villains would step out, going onto the streets of this city, as Izuku would give the word to All Might, as All Might would then signal back to the rescue heroes, as they would then start to evacuate the city, as they were on the outskirts of the city where the League of Villains headquarters was, so they just didn't have to basically just cause anyone to leave their homes there, as it was quite dangerous. And it was also very lucky that the League of Villains hideout was on the outskirts, because basically no one lived there. It was just basically a trash dump. So Izuku would then look over towards everyone, as he would then signal for them to start fighting, as Izuku would then see every one of the people he would train to charge forward, as the League of Villains would then charge forward themselves, as Izuku would see many of them had actually not gained their full strength back, which actually caused them to get a greater advantage over the villains, as many of the heroes had gotten quite just the recovery because of Recovery Girl, and they recovered quite quickly, while the villains had not. It's time for your reign over the villain world to end, All For One, All Might would end up saying, stepping towards him, as All For One would glare looking towards him. I don't want to fight you. I'm more interested in this white-haired boy, as he would create his hand flat before sending out a very small ki blast that went flying towards All Might, as it would hit All Might directly through the heart, causing All Might to fall down to his knees, as he would fall down dead, as Izuku would look on in shock at the sheer power that this tiny little ki blast had just shown. It had gone straight through one of his strongest warriors that he had trained in not even a second under that, as Izuku would look over towards All For One, who was now laughing. You think you can beat me? Your army may be able to beat my army, but that means nothing. I'll be able to crush thousands of everyone here. This world will never see the amount of casualties I'll put upon it, as Izuku would look towards All For One before charging at him. All For One would merely dodge Izuku's attack before punching him down to the ground, as Izuku would look over towards All For One before jumping right back up, not being fazed at all by All For One's punch, going for another punch. However, All For One had not done this at all, as he would see Izuku going for a punch and would let it hit him, much like how Goku did in some of his fights, as the punch would connect with All For One's helmet. However, it did nothing at all, as All For One deemed Izuku too weak to even fight him, backhanding Izuku as Izuku would be sent flying back. As Izuku, looking towards All For One, would end up laughing. "You failed, All For One. I know you may be stronger than me now, but I will end up beating you. And plus, you will let yourself go. You've been all-powerful for years. I know that. You've just spent the time gathering information and planning. However, you decided to let yourself get injured, which is a fatal mistake by you." As Izuku would jump towards All For One, sending any ki blasts going right towards him, as they would all land, connecting. However, they did barely any damage to him, as All For One would end up walking towards Izuku before grabbing him by the neck and slamming him into the ground. "You can't beat me, Izuku. Just give up already." As all of a sudden, Nejire would come out of nowhere, going for a punch to All For One. However, he would punch her right in the gut. "Oh, what do we have here? One of your little friends trying to interfere with my fight. That won't do. Shall we deal with her, Izuku?" As Izuku would look up barely after being held down by All For One with his strong grip around his neck. As you would form a keyblade around his hand, All For One would raise his keyblade up and was about to slash down towards Nejire. However, Izuku's hand would grab All For One's, holding it back from doing so. As blood would go down Izuku's face, Izuku would look up towards All For One, as his shaky hand would end up releasing from All For One, as he would fall limp down to the floor, as All For One had slammed him to the ground after choking him out with his hand. As Nejire would see this, grabbing Izuku, yelling, "You monster, how could you do this?" As All For One would end up laughing. "You think I'm a monster? I've been that way for years. You heroes know nothing about me, just like I know nothing about you. So why don't you stay out of this?" As All For One would backhand Nejire much like he had backhanded Izuku. Now, where were we? Izuku, who was going in and out of consciousness, would barely be able to stand himself up, as All For One would once again grab him by the neck, lifting him up once again. "Do you see this?" All For One would yell. "This is what all of you will look like. Why don't you go ahead and retreat now and just give up? Stop this hero society once and for all," dangling Izuku's limp body by the neck, as Izuku grabbing onto All For One's hand, trying to pull it off, but it would do nothing, as All For One would rear back his hand as if he was about to throw Izuku, throwing him into a massive skyscraper, as it would then topple down onto Izuku, as Izuku's body was then crushed by the many bricks. All For One, after receiving a ton of damage from this, after just going way too far, he had used a ton of his energy, which allowed for Izuku in his final moments to do a sneak attack right on him, making a massive key ball in the palm of his hand. However, it wasn't massive yet, as he would launch it towards All For One as he was flying back, basically using all of his energy that was left, after being thrown by All For One, creating this ki blast and sending it flying towards All For One, mimicking what All For One had done to All Might, as this ki blast would end up landing right into All For One's helmet, destroying it, causing All For One to receive a ton of damage to the head and skull area. As his helmet was destroyed, falling to pieces, he would use one of the corks he had acquired to go into the ground, warping himself back to where the doctor had been located so that he could fix him up. However, this damage that he had sustained was not as fixable as it should have been, as the breathalyzer that he had to allow him to breathe had also been damaged, which was located around his lungs, and it was going to take far more just time, possibly even years, to fix this permanently, and since they can't, they had to go with a more temporary option. So, with All For One gone, and most of the villains having been knocked out by Class 1A, Class 1B, and also the Big Three, the heroes would end up leaving, deeming it as a somewhat of a victory. However, many of those villains were also taken away, as Kurogiri had decided to sit in the shadows, much like he had during just the training camp, and he ended up being able to warp many of the villains away, including Todoroki, who had also managed to defeat most of Class 1A, as it took their strongest to even take him down, including Mirio and Tamaki. So Izuku, now lying under a pile of rubble, they tried to search for him, but his body was gone. They couldn't find it, and so they had to sadly deem that he was dead. So, going back to UA, they would find that it was in ruins, having been destroyed by something. They weren't quite sure, but possibly thought that it was another attack that All For One might have thrown and missed. So, many of the students sitting in the ruins of UA would wonder where they were going, or what they were going to do now, as they all thought about what Izuku had done, how All For One held him up by the neck and just showed that he was weak. How could they ever defeat someone so strong? He defeated their teacher in less than a couple blows. All For One was truly terrorizing them. So they would all decide to train as hard as they possibly could, harder than they ever did, harder than they did at the training camp, harder than they did to get into UA. And that's what they did, as they all wanted to beat and finish All For One. They wanted to make this world at peace, as Izuku had told them that was one of his dreams, and to honor the death of their teacher, they wanted to do it, to honor Izuku. However, Izuku wasn't dead. He had managed to escape the pile of rubble and decided it would be safer for them to think he was dead than alive. Izuku had left the scene as he was too weak to continue on fighting, rather going into the forest to just think about how he lost and the battle that had just occurred, as he would be sitting under a tree just thinking, how could I fail my class? How could I fail my teachers? How could I fail this country and the world? Why? As Izuku would be thinking about how he wasn't strong enough and that he would never be able to beat All For One. However, he would end up hearing a voice inside of his head. Oh, come on, I've faced far more threats than you. You need to toughen up, Izuku. I've seen your life events. I've seen how they played out. You need to toughen up, Izuku. Start training like you're gonna die, or your friends are gonna die if you don't. That's what I had to do. As Izuku would end up hearing this voice, wondering who it was, as Izuku looking around, as the voice would then speak again. You probably don't know who I am, so I'll just tell you this. I'm your father. The power you have, I unlocked it after a while, or I had it after a fight I had with an opponent. But that doesn't matter now. You just need to train. I know you can beat this threat, or All For One, as you call him. I know you can beat him. You just have to train your hardest. You just gotta believe, because your friends are counting on you. As Izuku would nod his head to his inner voice, is what he called it, as Izuku would start to train. As 2 weeks would end up passing, as Izuku would return to the UA ruins, as he would see his classmates standing there, all training, hoping that they could find All For One and win. As the city lay in ruins, Izuku wouldn't bother to go and mention that his classmates, he was alive, but much rather just went to the city, not wanting to risk their lives or risk the fact that they could die in this battle. As Izuku would return to the city, as he would see just the city in complete ruins, as he would yell for All For One to reveal himself and to stop being such a coward, as All For One would appear out of nowhere, laughing. So it appears you've come back, Izuku. I knew you wouldn't have died from something as weak as that. So, I guess you wanted me to finish you off. I guess I should probably do that to stop your suffering from going any further, as All For One would launch himself towards Izuku. However, Izuku would grab his fist, twisting it as All For One couldn't move it. Izuku would jump back as he would further start to calm himself down, as he would start to power up even further, as he would jump towards All For One, dodging All For One's fist before punching him directly into the stomach, as his other hand would go in, shattering All For One's temporary helmet with a singular punch, as All For One would jump back holding his head in excruciating pain, as All For One would then start to choke, not being able to breathe, as Izuku would start to power up his hands, powering up an attack, as Izuku would send a ki blast going hurling towards All For One, landing a direct blow, as the ki blast would then expand rapidly, vaporizing All For One, an attack Izuku had used many times before, as Izuku would then see his friends standing there, watching Izuku having beaten All For One there, as Izuku would then tell them that the fight is not over yet, and that they still have much more to do. And that's where this what if ends. Izuku had returned the world to peace, as the remaining of the heroes there would end up hunting down the entirety of the villains left in the League of Villains, just destroying the remaining of the villainous ki users, while also training many users to use ki as well. However, Izuku had wished for ki to just stop existing, as it would be better for them just to use quirks, as they can only use ki when it was a bigger threat, something that Izuku would have to give them just the option to use, as Izuku knew that if ki were to get out to the public, people would try to learn it and become evil, being twisted by the power that it brings. And so, with this what if ending, I thank you all for watching. I thank you all for watching the past 6 parts, and this being the 7th. I thank you all for watching once again, and goodbye.